Okay, I think we'll get started. I know that a few more are going to be coming in, but let me say welcome to the IISS, or the annex of the IISS here at Bloomsbury House. I'm Dana Allen. I'm editor of Survival and senior fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy and Transatlantic Affairs at the Institute. There's now a plausible chain of events leading to Britain's exit from the European Union in this decade. I don't say probable, but it's certainly plausible. And I've been thinking about convening a panel on this subject ever since Philip Gordon's comments at the U.S. Embassy in January caused something of a stir. And I can see why the fact that he was saying anything at all in an official capacity on these matters caused resentment in some quarters. But my reaction at the time was that the comments themselves represented the most, how to put it, anodyne, basic, boilerplate, bread and butter, fundamental expression of the U.S. definition of its own interests in the matter. So I may say a little bit more about that after our two main panelists have spoken. In any event, the U.S. view, the effects of a British referendum on U.S.-UK relations is important, but hardly the defining question, or the only defining question. And our discussion today will go into broader strategic implications of Britain's choice, obviously, for Britain, for the EU, and for the United States, and maybe I should add for the rest of the world. And for this discussion, we are privileged to have two of the world's leading experts on Europe and the UK in Europe. I don't know if I usually say that, but I say it today without even a hint of a blush. Charles Grant is founding director of the Center for European Reform, which I think most of you know as an astonishingly effective think tank that has established a really impressive balance of objective analysis and not exactly advocacy, I guess, but so much as a clear moral and strategic position. Before that, he was a journalist for The Economist and other publications. I think I can say you've founded the Center for European Reform 15 years ago, because that's how long I've been in Britain. That's when it was done. Erik Jones is professor and director of European and Eurasian Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's also founding director of the Bologna Institute for Policy Research. He's based in Bologna at the Bologna Center. He's a contributing editor of Survival. And so in addition to being a longtime friend, we have a kind of symmetry in our relationship. He's my boss at Hopkins, where I'm also an adjunct professor, and I'm his boss at Survival. So it's kind of mutual deterrence or something. Erik is a leading expert on the Euro crisis, and he's actually working on a book right now on the subject. We'll start with Charles, who will speak for, well, as long as you want.
Well,
but
how long do you want me to speak for?
10 to 15 minutes.
That's fine. I'll divide my remarks into three sort of groups of thoughts. Firstly, what's happening in the EU at the moment. Secondly, the British relationship with the EU. And thirdly, the strategic implications. A lot of interesting trends in the EU at the moment. I mean, one is Germany. For the first time in the history of the EU, Germany is in charge of the EU. This never happened before. It was always Franco-German leadership, or in the early years of Blair, British Franco-German leadership. The Germans are learning that with power goes responsibility. They're learning rather slowly. Many of their partners believe they're not behaving in a particularly responsible manner, particularly in the way they handled the Euro crisis. There has been a long-term shift in the way that Germans treat the EU. When I was in Brussels 20 years ago, most Germans thought what was good for the EU was good for them and vice versa. There's been a gradual realization in Germany over the last 20 years that what was good for the EU is not necessarily good for them. This happened with enlargement, bringing in lots of poor countries who wanted German money. And it's happened with the Euro crisis, where the Germans see other unsuccessful economies trying to grab German money for bailouts and so on. So there's been this divorce, really, between Germany and the European mainstream. The way that Germans have handled the crisis, in particular prevarication, seeing it all as other people's problems, moralizing, towards other countries in the way that they mishandle their economies, not seeming to understand how financial markets work some of the time. All this has added to a wave of Germanophobia across many parts of the EU, which is very dangerous for the EU and very dangerous for Germany. Now, the reason that Germany is in charge of the EU is not just that the German economy has done fairly well, it's also that the French are much less powerful than I've ever known them in the 25 years I've followed the EU, partly because their economy is perceived as being quite weak relative to Germany's. The Franco-German relationship, which I've followed for a long time, is certainly in a weaker state today than it's ever been before. It's almost disappeared. It's been the rock upon which European integration has been built. But because of the economic inequality between France and Germany, which has led the Germans to treat the French with great arrogance at times and the French to be prickly and insecure when they deal with the Germans, this rock has really crumbled, and there's constant attempts to patch it up, and they'll always get together and have summits and produce joint papers, but really this rock is pretty crumbly as far as I'm concerned. Another reason why Germany is in charge is that the Commission has disappeared. 25 years ago, the Commission set the agenda for what happened in the EU and was a very important organisation when Jacques Delors ran it. Now the Commission has been sort of pushed aside during the eurozone crisis because the money for the bailouts comes from member states, not the EU budget. Barroso is perceived as a very weak and ineffective leader. And another reason why the Commission has lost the respect of governments is that it seems to be in hock to the European Parliament. So it's pushing through lots of rules and regulations that the European parliamentarians want. And the commissioners are scared of the MEPs these days. And the final reason why the Germans are in charge is because the British are on the way out. And obviously, as Van Rompuy so eloquently put it in London a few months ago, it's very hard to convince a room if one hand is on the door handle. So let me say a few words about Britain. Cameron's choice, the speech he gave in January gives him two choices. Firstly, he can pursue a reform agenda, little nitty-gritty reforms of the Working Time Directive or bigger role for national parliaments or trade agreements or whatever, little reforms, liberalisation of services that don't require treaty change or that would require a small change to the treaties but would not affect the fundamental balance between member states and the EU itself. And if he pursues such a reform agenda, I have reason to believe he will find friends and allies, because as I go around other European capitals talking to governments, a lot of them realise that on involving national parliaments or impact assessments, reducing over-regulation, repealing old laws, there's lots of kind of nitty-gritty things you could do that need to be done, and Cameron could find a lot of allies, in my view, if he pursues that agenda. But his second choice is to go further than that and actually try and repatriate significant powers from the EU to the member states in agriculture, fish, social policy, free movement of labour. And as the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee reported this week, if he pursues that option, he will fail, because there is absolutely no desire in other member state governments, even Germany, to allow either a repatriation of powers to everybody or specific UK opt-outs. The desire is not there. A lot of Tories make the mistake of thinking because the Germans are so desperate to keep us in the EU, they will allow us to opt out of all the things we don't like about the EU. That is sadly not the case. And my worry is that Cameron actually, from my own conversations with some of his advisors, is going to pursue the second option, the option that cannot succeed, because his party will push him to do that. Now, Ed Miliband, very briefly, doesn't want a referendum because he thinks he'd lose it if there was one, if he's Prime Minister, if he promises a referendum. He's under pressure, of course, to offer one. If UKIP wins the European elections next year, as they probably will, he may offer one, but my reading of his mind is he won't, because he thinks he won't get extra votes by promising a referendum. Didn't do Cameron much good when he promised that. And so he'll tough it out and not promise one. Doesn't mean there won't be a referendum one day, because the Tories have been winning elections since the 17th century, and one day they'll win an election with a majority and hold a referendum, probably. Brief word on Scotland. I was there recently. What I learnt in Scotland is that there may be a second Scottish referendum on leaving the UK. We all know there's going to be one in 2014. The Scottish will probably vote to stay in the UK. But then, if in 2017, according to Cameron's timetable, the Scottish vote to leave, the British vote to leave the EU, which is perfectly plausible, then the Scottish will have another referendum, because the circumstances will have changed. And I've seen opinion polls suggesting that if Scotland is if Britain is outside the EU, do you want to stay part of the United Kingdom? Then about 50% of Scots want to leave the United Kingdom. At the moment it's about 30%, but if we leave the UK, if Britain leaves the EU, then many more Scots want to leave the UK so they can get back into the EU than is the case today. So I think one consequence of Britain leaving the EU will be a breakup of the United Kingdom. I feel fairly sure about that. Finally, some of the strategic implications. In a way, let me look at it through an American prism, or a kind of Phil Gordon prism. De Gaulle famously said, the British are a Trojan horse for the United States and Europe, so we mustn't let them into the EU. Well, of course, de Gaulle was absolutely right on that, which is why the Americans like us being in the EU, and will, I believe, be extremely concerned if we look like leaving the EU. One thing the British do that the Americans like is push for enlargement. Enlargement would not have happened in the way it's happened when it has happened without strong British pressure for it to happen. We are always the most enlargement. Some may say for the worst reasons, because we want to weaken and undermine the European institutions, but nevertheless we have been always a force for enlargement. Without the UK, that force will be greatly weakened, and there's really nobody else apart from Carl Bildt these days who's in favour of much more enlargement apart from the Brits. Secondly, obviously the British push for free trade, and the British and the Germans are the two governments that are most responsible for putting the TTIP on the agenda, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I've heard American officials say recently, if the British leave the EU, we'll never get the TTIP. It just won't happen without the Brits. Thirdly, of course, the British push for a single market, and they are the main force now pushing for the liberalisation of services industries in Europe, which is the big bit of the single market that has not been achieved. Now, that's not so directly relevant to the US, but it is a bit relevant, because only if you liberalise services will you get growth and a more successful European economy, and that is in the American interest. Plus, American companies operating in Europe very much want to be part of the single market, and many of those who choose to locate in London would have to relocate, or would wish to relocate, to the continent of Europe if Britain leaves the EU in order to retain good access to the single market. Fourthly, European defence. The British have ensured that European defence, to the extent that it exists, has not been built as something hostile to NATO. It's been NATO compatible. And the Americans, who initially were very wary of what was then called the ESDP, the European Security and Defence Policy, when it was first mooted in 1998 by Blair and Chirac, those Americans were very wary and no longer wary, partly because the French rejoined NATO and partly because clearly the problem in Europe is just that they're going to do too little in defence, not that they might do too much in defence. But of course, if the British leave the EU, then the still rather unimpressive but not irrelevant EU defence capability will be weaker, and it might be less Atlanticist. In fact, it almost certainly would be less Atlanticist, and it could become more of a problem for the US. Finally, the British have been very influential in EU foreign policy. Not just to push it in a kind of Atlanticist direction, though that's part of it. On the Middle East peace process, the British are not in the same place as the Americans, but more just to make it effective. I mean, without the British and the French, the EU would be even less effective as a global actor than it is. I know everybody likes to say it's useless, and it is in some ways not impressive, but it's done more than some people give it credit for. The Iranian nuclear diplomacy has been a great success, a process, if not an outcome, led by the British, French, Germans and Cathy Ashton, persuading the Americans, Russians, Chinese to follow it. The Americans have been very impressed by the sanctions that the EU has imposed on Iran recently, the oil sanctions. I think in Somalia, a good example of a joined-up EU foreign policy involving trade, aid, security assistance, training. The British have been instrumental in putting together the EU's policies on Somalia. Burma, the British were very influential again in getting the EU to remove sanctions against Burma and helping the regime there to modernise, reform, and potentially in the Middle East. I mean, the EU does not achieve really anything in the Middle East peace process now, but if ever ever that process revives and the EU ever wants to revive, it'll be much stronger with the British engagement than not. So if the British were to leave the EU, it would, I conclude, be very bad for the transatlantic relationship because the EU would be less interesting to the US, less powerful as a global partner helping the US, less sympathetic to the US. Europe as a whole would be much less able to be an effective global actor. There'd be less economic growth in the European Union, which would be bad for America and bad for the world economy, because I do believe the British influence in favour of free markets and free trade is quite significant, more than people realise, and without it, Europe would be more protectionist. And of course, back to where I started, if the British leave the EU, the Germans are on their own, running it, and they don't want to be on their own. And they will, therefore, the tensions between Germany and its partners are likely to flare up and be quite nasty at times. And it really is the case that the Germans are terrified of us leaving. But that doesn't mean that they will let us opt out of policies we don't like. And somebody needs to tell the Conservative Party that fact. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. I have quite a few follow-up questions, but which I'll save for after Erik speaks. But I mean, one just leapt out at me from the beginning because you said, I said there's a plausible chain of events leading to Britain's exit from the European Union, and I heard you saying Britain's on the way out. Do you think it reaches above plausibility to more than 50-50?
About 2 or 3 years ago, before it was fashionable, I said there's a 50-50 chance of Britain leaving the EU by 2020. That's still my line, though everybody else is saying it, so it's no longer fashionable to say it.
Thank you. Erik.
Well, first, I should say it's a great pleasure to be here in London. It's an enormous privilege to speak to such a distinguished audience, and it's a real honor to work with Dana and Charles, particularly to hear what Charles has to say, because he's such an astute observer of what's going on here in the UK and at the European level writ large. That said, I'm a less astute observer in the sense that I look at things from this weird American perspective. When I lived in Nottingham, my kids used to get up early in the morning to go see the garbage truck, and I kept trying to explain that to my neighbors, and they finally pointed out to me that it's called a dustbin lorry, and I realized that I was never actually going to be able to understand things in the British way. So what I'm going to do is tell a very similar story to what Charles told, but I'm going to tell it from this American perspective, hopefully to give you a sense of how the U.S. administration perceives this and what are the strategic implications from a transatlantic context. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to answer 4 different questions. What is Europe? What's wrong with Europe? What are the implications for the United States? And what are the implications for the special relationship? Now, when I say what is Europe, the question that I'm asking actually is a positive riff on David Cameron's speech. Charles, I think, does a very good job highlighting the implications of Cameron's speech for British policy, but there's this very carefully worded and artfully constructed interpretation of European integration that's embedded within the speech that, as an American, I found actually quite refreshing. The point that Cameron makes is that there's an awful lot more diversity in the relationships between European Union member states and European Union institutions than we are often wont to admit. He points to the differing memberships of the single currency and the differing memberships of Schengen. There are obviously a large number of derogations from different policies by different member states. When I lived in Belgium, for example, there was a huge derogation on the allowance of foreigners to vote in local elections because of the sensitivity in Brussels to the impact that a lot of French-speaking foreigners would have on the delicate balance of power between French-speaking and Flemish-speaking Belgian citizens. So there's an awful lot of variety within the European Union. But as an American, I also have a hard time equating the European Union with Europe. And as we begin to layer on a series of other organizations, some of which no longer even claim to have a European vocation, like the OECD, but also the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and lots of other fora where the United States tries to interact with its European allies, including, obviously, NATO, what you begin to see is that there's a huge amount of variety in the way Europe is structured and institutionalized. And what David Cameron was pointing out was that there's no reason for us to pretend that this variety does not exist. As a matter of fact, why don't we celebrate this variety and use this variety both to achieve commonly held objectives and to satisfy the peculiarities of our national constituencies. Now, if you look closely at the speech, the weird thing is to try to find illustrations of where Britain is damaged by the imposition of common norms. And the only one that you can really dig up is this thing about junior doctors not being allowed to work as many hours as God sends them. And it strikes me that this is hardly a huge disruption. And in the context of the way we try to understand market regulation, the assumption in the British conversation that there would be no regulation if there were no European Union, an assumption I think that Katinka Barisic makes quite forcefully in one of her policy memos that came out of the CER, the assumption is entirely flawed, right? So John Cunliffe, the UKREP right now, likes to talk about an old brand of Euroscepticism in the United Kingdom. He calls it the straight banana variety, where the British complained about the rules on the shape of bananas, but you have to ask yourself, if the European Union did not exist, would you be satisfied to go out and buy a round banana, right? If somebody delivered a round banana in a box to your doorstep, wouldn't you want to complain? And if you did complain, you would discover that there are some rules somewhere in the UK that describes, in at least the most approximate terms, the shape that a banana is supposed to take. Now, this is an important point to note, because what David Cameron seems to be objecting to is the imposition of these uniform rules, many of which are actually favored by British business, right? You talk to Kingfisher, for example, and ask them what it is that they would like to see. They would like to see one set of rules for big box stores across Europe, because then they could take the same big box store plans and impose them across Europe without having to get them recertified by different professional groups in each of the different markets in which they try to operate. Now, in that kind of a context, you begin to see that maybe what David Cameron is arguing for is symbolically important, but arguably less radical than you might imagine. And this Europe that he actually describes is the Europe that we live in, and so it's hard to understand what the big brouhaha is about. I think that the answer comes in the one thing that I would truly disagree with in David Cameron's speech. What he says in the speech is, the single currency was a mistake, the single market was the great success. Actually, I would reverse that. If we're trying to understand what's going wrong in Europe right now, it is a design flaw in the single market, not in the single currency. A design flaw that allowed huge volumes of savings to move from countries where savings was in excess to countries where there were surplus opportunities for investment. And as the savings piled up in enormous stocks of investment, it created a vulnerability for which the architects of the single market had failed to anticipate. A vulnerability that what do we do when these stocks are liquidated and that money is called home, and the economies in which this investment was located suddenly find themselves devoid of any form of liquidity. Now, for those of you who are curious, what you should note is that this is a problem that is not unique to countries in the eurozone. As a matter of fact, the first country to experience this in significant form was Iceland. It's a country that still suffers under capital controls today, precisely to try to keep that stock of foreign investment in place. Now, other countries that experience the same dynamic would include Latvia and Hungary, both outside the Eurozone. The countries that have experienced it within the Eurozone have obviously become increasingly large and more problematic along the way. And so the question is, if this is what's wrong with Europe, right, not something that is due to the single currency, but due to the integration of the European financial space, and if indeed we look at the problems that Europe suffers from right now as being a direct result of the disintegration of European financial space, then you have to ask yourself, well, who is best suited to help redesign the architecture of European finance in order to create more stability? And obviously, you would want the United Kingdom to take part in those conversations. You would want the United Kingdom to take part in those conversations because the alternative is the continental solution that's being developed right now, which is signally unfavorable to the future of London as a financial capital. I mean, look at the 4 April press conference of Mario Draghi. He uses as an illustration of an oversized financial system, not just Cyprus, but also the United Kingdom, and argues that we need to redimension financial institutions so that they are in line with their underlying national economies. Now, this strikes me as a frightening prospect, particularly if your goal is to have world-beating financial institutions and you're limited to an economy of about 60 million people, you would like to have these world-beating financial institutions actually servicing and being serviced by a much larger economic domain, particularly if you want to compete with the United States, if you want to compete with Japan, and you want to compete with China. And the only way that you can do that is to create a way to channel the resources of the entire financial space to stabilize your financial institutions. Otherwise, you end up like Cyprus or Iceland. Now, in that context, if you accept my interpretation of what's wrong with Europe, I'm sure that won't be an amazingly popular interpretation here in London, but if you were to accept that interpretation of what's wrong with Europe, you could see why Britain would want to participate, and you can also see the difficulty that Britain faces in trying to shape a conversation when it feels like it's being outvoted by countries in the eurozone. So there is a European political problem related to the construction of the single currency, but it's one that David Cameron, I think, has done well to master in many respects. Look at the voting weights in the European Banking Authority, for example, and one that he should continue to engage with, because if he doesn't do that, I think Britain stands to lose, and quite significantly. Well, why should we care from the United States? Well, here, I have to disagree a bit with the idea that Britain is the Trojan horse in European integration, because that implies a much more sophisticated understanding of European integration than anyone in Washington possesses. I think most people in Washington face with two different possibilities. One is to look at Europe as the opportunity, the sort of breeding ground for coalitions of the willing, and the other is to view Europe as a pre-organized, institutionalized form of cooperation that creates a viable partner for the United States. Now, the pivot between these two different interpretations actually takes place between the first George W. Bush administration and the second George W. Bush administration. In the first administration, they tried for the coalitions of the willing approach. It was not as successful as they would have liked for it to be. And so in the second George W. Bush administration, they began to embrace a much more monolithic conception of Europe. Not because they thought that this monolithic Europe would always agree with them, but because even having a difficult negotiating partner that was somehow coherent is preferable to having a cacophony of diverse voices that lack capability to partner with you effectively. The Obama administration has banked a lot on having a coherent European partner. That's what the pivot is. The pivot in the United States is not viewed as a pivot from Europe to Asia. It's viewed as a pivot from the Middle East to Asia, where our European partners are supposed to take more responsibility for the Middle East, North Africa neighborhood space. And their inability to do that effectively is problematic. If Britain were to leave, that would be more problematic still. And this is where we get to the special relationship. You see, the United States actually works quite well with the British in terms of military cooperation and foreign policy cooperation, and it often uses the British as the bridgehead for organizing more effective cooperative ventures with the rest of Europe as well, including the French. The French were very close allies of the United States, and yet nevertheless occasionally problematic, tend to work very well together with the Brits. The problem is that if the Brits go off on their own and somehow alienate the French, then organizing some kind of cooperative relationship between Britain and France and the United States becomes much more complicated. And the idea that we would have to choose between a Britain that wants to be independent and the rest of Europe that we need, at least for capability purposes, particularly as we move into the soft foreign policy domains, I think would be very problematic for a U.S. administration as they sought to find the most effective way to partner with an effective actor in order to alleviate some of the responsibilities that the U.S. feels it must take up in the region immediately around Europe. So we look at the idea of Britain leaving the European Union as one that would affect our relationship with Britain, because it would make it so much harder to partner with Britain and with Europe at the same time to achieve common objectives. And in that sense, the strategic implications are that the pivot for the Obama administration would be much less likely to achieve success, and there would be huge resentment, I think, within the Congress at the need to invest ever-increasing amounts of resources as we try to stabilize Europe, meaning, in this point, particularly North Africa and the Middle East. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks very much to both of you. Let me try to play devil's advocate here for a minute. And this is a sort of general question to both of you. I mean, and again, looking at it from the American point of view, but obviously it has implications for everyone's success. you know, I think after Phil Gordon made those comments, and then Cameron and Obama had their meeting, I guess, a couple weeks ago. I mean, one thing that's evident is the United States is not clear exactly what it wants out of Europe. It just wants more of it. It wants it to be coherent, among other things, as I think both of you have suggested. Is there any argument, and I fear Charles is going to object to this most strenuously, but maybe both of you, is there any argument that the coherence of the European Union would be improved by Britain's exit? You know, it's always, Charles, you talked about one of the things that Americans want out of the EU and like having Britain push for is enlargement. I mean, enlargement has been to a certain extent a two-edged sword. I mean, it has to have, it seems to me almost mathematically, a complicating effect on coherence. So I guess what I'm just trying to ask is to game out in certain ways positive scenarios for how the pieces would be reorganized after Britain's exit.
Okay, on that one, Dana. On enlargement, I think enlargement is dead anyway. I mean, Croatia's joining in a few months. Serbia might join if it's lucky in about 10 years' time, if it's very lucky and everything goes very well. But essentially, although everybody accepts the principles of the Western Balkans to join the EU, it's going very, very slowly. Germany is extremely hostile to enlargement now, having been sympathetic to enlargement until about 5 years ago. Without the British, less pressure for enlargement, but it's not really happening anyway, so I don't think the British departure would make very much difference. It is true that the British are in favour of Turkish accession. The British and the Swedes remain, I suppose, a few others like the Spanish and the Italians and a few others. But there isn't going to be Turkish accession, and I think the British government is wrong to waste political capital on pursuing an option that is impossible for the foreseeable future. I wouldn't say Turkey can never join, but when there are more journalists in prison in Turkey than China, it's hard to make the case for Turkish membership of the EU. And it's not just that Austria, Germany, France and the Netherlands cannot conceive of Turkey joining the EU. It's not going to happen. So I don't think British exit would make a huge difference there. In other areas, I suppose where the British have been outliers has been in institutional reform and accepting QMV, majority voting, in various policy areas on taxation. But of course, other countries have hid behind us. I mean, on taxation, for example, the Irish, the Slovaks, many other countries, the Luxembourgers, are horrified with the thought of majority voting on tax, but they'd just like to have the British do the vetoing for them. I think on institutional reform, further integration, arguably without the British, things would move ahead a bit more strongly. But really, are the British the main obstacle to a more integrated political union? Or isn't it just that the people of Europe don't want it? That the EU hasn't got the legitimacy, and that if you put a more united political union to the voters in a referendum in France, say, they'd certainly vote no. In Italy, I'm told by, well, you live in Italy and I don't, I'm told by some of my friends in Italy that if there's a referendum on political union in Italy, a lot of people would vote no these days. So I think the real break on integration is not the British, it's actually the illegitimacy of the EU and the inability of Europe's leaders to sell the project to European voters.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to ask you to follow up on this, but I accept that. But in a way, what the situation you're describing is part of my question, which I didn't express very well, because we're obviously at a question. I mean, the EU has a legitimacy crisis, a very large crisis having to do with the euro and a lot of and German dominance and everything else you've been talking about. So this crisis is going to have to be solved, and maybe we need to game out, again, this is the devil's advocacy, maybe we have to game out different solutions, different scenarios, including the one where Britain is no longer a member of the EU but has a very close relationship, continues this very strong defense relationship with France, which is obviously delivering, I mean, maybe not obviously, but it seems to me is delivering most of what the United States is going to get out of a military partnership with the EU anyway. Anyway, I won't ask you to follow up on that, but Eric, I don't know if you have anything to say before I open it up.
Just two different things. I mean, there's a huge irony that we talk in hypothetical terms about Britain possibly maybe trying to repatriate powers as the Bundesverfassungsgericht in Karlsruhe, the German Constitutional Court, is actively re-engineering parliamentary oversight over agreed European, and we just sort of accept that, right? I mean, because that's what the German Constitutional Court does, is it just repatriates parliamentary oversight over everything that we've agreed to, and we can't really stop them because there are a bunch of crazy jurists in Karlsruhe. I don't think that it is impossible to imagine that we could change I'm not sure a competence review is the way to do it, but that we could change the balance of authority. Having said that, I don't think we get to I think Charles is absolutely right, I don't think we get to a more coherent European Union without the Brits. I think what we do is we discover that a lot of the smaller countries are hiding behind Britain and actively supporting Britain. I mean, the Danes are a great example. The Danes have more opt-outs than the Brits do, and then they go around Brussels and say, oh, but we're not bad because we're not Britain, right? And in that sense are able quite effectively to hide the unique relationship that they have. And I think you would find the Dutch and the Belgians would be quite uncomfortable in a European Union that lacked this kind of British counterweight to the overweening influence of France and Germany on their borders.
Okay, thank you. Alex.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Alex Nickel from the IISS.
This question just follows what Charles said at the beginning, which is that if you can recall the first approach that we described, there were common causes to be found with other countries, therefore potentially a deal to be done that could gain agreement across the EU. What would be the issues that might find common cause? If there are such issues and potential agreements, then would that then satisfy, do you think, the people, enough politicians in Parliament, the UK Parliament, for that to pass, to pass a referendum, to get them to support a referendum? Bearing in mind that, as Eric said at the beginning, that most people are sort of broadly pro-Europe, don't really understand what the problem is. What is the problem that people are trying to get fixed?
Well, that's a really good question, Alex. I mean, in about 2.5 weeks' time, or 3 weeks' time, the CER will publish a set of proposals on how to reform the EU along the first scenario outlined, like modest changes, either which require no treaty change to allow them to happen, or just a very little tweaking of the treaties. Now, I'll let you into a secret. This publication that we're working on, my colleagues and I, it's not very exciting. It's actually quite boring. It's things like improving the way the EU does impact assessments, because before it legislates, the Commission assesses the impact of a draft piece of legislation, and in theory, if the impact assessment is this will hurt growth, then they kind of shouldn't go ahead with it. In fact, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, it's to do with yellow card procedures which allow national parliaments to block legislation becoming a red card procedure which gives them more power to block legislation. It's about reforming the working time directive to overrule the CIMAP-Jaeger ECJ rulings on what happens when doctors are on call. It's kind of boring things like that. I think there is potential scope for Britain working with its partners on a lot of quite boring, humdrum, nitty-gritty changes. But absolutely, this will not impress Bill Cash and the army of British Eurosceptics. They'll say this is piffle. And in a way, they'll be right. It won't change the fundamentals of Britain's relationship with the EU. They want repatriation of powers, and they're not going to get them.
You want to add something?
No.
No. Okay. Jason Ottaway.
So when I said that it would be harder to partner, I said particularly when you move into the soft side of foreign policy. I couldn't agree more, right? You know, from an American perspective, NATO is an intrinsic part of Europe, right? I mean, we don't think about NATO in the Middle East, and we don't really think about NATO in Asia. We think about NATO in Europe. I mean, obviously, if we're going to use NATO as an instrument to intervene in other parts of the world, then the usefulness of it is a way of taking these bilateral relationships and then strengthening them in a multilateral fashion, like we did in Libya, for example. And you're absolutely right. That's not going to change because nobody's talking about bringing the UK out of NATO.
Charles, maybe you want to address that. I mean, because I think about, you mentioned that the United States, that Washington was very impressed, for example, by the fact that the EU is now not importing a single drop of Iranian oil. Mm-hmm. And there are other areas of foreign policy writ large where Europe, in however you define it, is actually very coherent. I mean, even on issues where it doesn't have much, maybe has limited influence, like the Middle East, nonetheless, its position, it seems to me, is rather coherent. Would that change if Britain left the EU?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's on the Middle East, Dana. I mean, the EU tends to divide three ways on the Middle East. On the recognition of the Palestinian territories in the United Nations, the Czechs voted with Israel, half the other countries abstained, and half the other countries voted against Israel. I mean, that wasn't a great moment of glory for European foreign policy. But no, I agree, we have the potential to be influential in the Middle East. Sorry.
Wait a minute, one could read that another way.
Yeah.
The abstentions and the votes for the Palestinians struck me as sort of expressions of the same coherent attitude. It's just that some were more deferential to Washington or...
Yes, well, when the Goldstone report on the Gaza uprising was published, was it about a year and a half ago? I forget when. The EU divided much more equally three ways than for, against, or not sure. But I don't think the EU's look very impressive when you look at the Middle East. The area where it's really not impressive, areas I work on actually, are Russia and China.
Right.
And this is where there are united European positions on Russia and China. There is an arms embargo on China, which is a united position. We don't give China market economy status. On Russia, we do actually criticize Russia on human rights sometimes, but we're not really effective on Russia and China because the big member states who dominate EU foreign policy don't think it's in their interests to work through the EU. If you look at Germany and China, 47% of all EU exports to China are German. And until recently, we did at least have a common commercial policy vis-à-vis China, but in the last few weeks, we've seen the Germans undermining it, with Mr. de Gucht trying to impose anti-dumping duties on China's solar panel exports. And whatever you think about the rights and wrongs of that argument, there are two sides to it, as to whether China is really dumping or not. My own view is it is. But the fact that the Germans went round, one by one, persuading other governments to back China against the European Commission, I think made me feel very uncomfortable indeed. The fact, I think, how can the EU be coherent vis-à-vis China if we don't stand together? I mean, Peter Mandelson said years ago when he was European Trade Commissioner, if I'm nice to the Chinese and talk sweetly to them, they don't give me anything I ask for in terms of market opening. And if I bang the table and get tough and threaten them, they don't give me anything. I think, but I would say, having spent some time looking at EU-China relations, that if we want to get anywhere, we have to be united and actually often work with the Americans, as we have done on some WTO issues. And then sometimes the Chinese do budge just a little bit. So back to what we're supposed to be talking about is that if the British think on their own, they will be able to influence China on market access. Clearly they're wrong. Your only chance is working through the EU with the Americans. But so your question was,
couldn't they still do it in a certain sense, even if
Norway,
even if they were a
yes.
big Switzerland in a way? Because
Norway has quite a successful, influential foreign policy without being part of the EU, I acknowledge. But that's because it's a kind of small, friendly country that hasn't invaded anybody else for quite a long time. And I'm not sure Britain could get away with being in Norway. But Erik might have a different view on that.
Well, I think, since my family comes from Norway, I think the last country we invaded was Britain.
Yes, yes.
No, I think that, the point that you're making that's really interesting in this context is the TTIP point, right? So if you think TTIP In the United States, we call it TTIP.
We don't
TTI,
use
transatlantic-
acronyms of any kind here. Can you please?
Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations that were discussed, obviously, last February. The communication, the 90-day discussion period in the United States started on the 20th of March and will finish on the 20th of June, and the expectation is that formal negotiations will begin thereafter. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is called a Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and not a Transatlantic Free Trade Area because the goal is not to lower tariff barriers between advanced industrial economies, tariff barriers which are already remarkably low, but rather to re-engineer the way we describe product standards, the way we do product certification and testing, the way we evaluate trade so that we can actually engage in distributed manufacturing on a much more competitive and cost-saving basis in the Atlantic basin, right? And then upload those norms onto our relationship with China. And this is why, despite the many controversies about different elements in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, most recently the cultural exception that's getting a lot of news in the media right now. Actually, I would argue the cultural exception from the American standpoint is a very minor concern because it has no embedded standards that will help us in order to upload standards onto the relationship with China so that we can push the cost of adjustment onto the Chinese rather than having to pay all those adjustment costs in the United States. And in not having Britain as part of this conversation, I think would complicate the negotiations. Certainly, it would be easier for us to elaborate common standards with a united voice if Britain wants to step out of that to the extent to which we are successful. Britain will find itself uploading the standards that we agree with our European partners. And I say if we are successful, there's a lot of qualifiers that go into that. But I think that's the ambition, at least the ambition when Ron Kirk was USTR and Karel Gucht as the Commission representative for trade.
I don't see any other hands right now. Oh, Alec. Well, actually, let me take this gentleman first and then Alex.
The conversation so far has been couched in the sense that the status quo within the EU and the eurozone remains relatively static. But some of the things Charles was saying suggest that the next 2 to 3 years could see some quite radical developments. I mean, France has moved clearly into the problem column from the solution column. Somebody said the other day, whatever France is, it's certainly not one of the pillars of the EU anymore. And it's potentially going to be very, very difficult as the imbalances between Germany and the rest inside the eurozone become very tense indeed. It's just possible we're beginning to see signs of some economic recovery in the UK, that the UK could start to see at least some modest growth, while within the eurozone the tensions get worse and worse. I mean, I'd just be interested in your view as to how that scenario might play out in terms of Britain then taking the higher ground of the Cameron position, pressing for single market services. Here is a region that talks of a single market. 75% of its collective GDP is services, and there's no single market in those. Energy liberalisation that we've talked about forever, and that's not happening. Negotiations with the US and indeed with Japan, where the UK is in the forefront of leading that debate for open trade. I mean, there are quite a number of things happening simultaneously that could just change the terms of this debate. And I'm not sure that's a question, but I'd be interested in your reflection on some of this.
Well, I mean, one could add to that, I would assume, as you think about the question, the fact that there's a euro crisis that some people say will have to be resolved with a much greater, with a political union, which I know I don't think either of you actually, I mean, we can define what a political union is, but exactly to this point, it's not a period where of stasis where the status quo is really viable. Can you guys take notes on that question so as not to forget it, and I'll ask Alex to.
My question is actually related in that one of the arguments that has been put forward for why Britain might want to leave the EU is because of fiscal compact,
What? Sorry.
the fiscal compact,
Yeah.
because eurozone
Go ahead.
Okay, well, on the fiscal compact, Britain's not in it. So it's a silly idea because the problem in Europe is not, in my view, the problem is some rather excessive emphasis on austerity and the restriction of the budgetary autonomy of national governments, which doesn't help the eurozone. So I don't think the fiscal compact is a good idea. Having said that, to answer the other question, I think the euro will muddle through. I'm not certain the euro will survive. I think it's highly likely it'll survive. There are two theories. One is that in order to survive, you need a political union with dramatic steps forward, and there just isn't the support for that in Germany because it would cost the Germans a lot of money through transfers to poorer countries. In France, because they don't want to have to ratify a new treaty. All of them don't want to give Britain the leverage to block such a new treaty, and they think the euro's most European governments think the euro is sort of doing all right, so there's no need for a radical leap forward. So I don't believe there'll be a big new treaty. Now, recently I've spoken to Mr. Asmussen in the European Central Bank, who takes a different view. He really believes, as do some senior figures in the British Treasury, that without a radical leap forward, the eurozone will crumble apart because of its internal contradictions. So, I hope I'm right. I think the euro can muddle through with a banking union, which must, of course, include a working resolution regime, a moderation of the austerity, which is happening. The austerity is being moderated now. Some rebalancing of the German economy so that Germany imports more and spends more, which isn't, well, you tell me, Eric, it's sort of, some people say it's beginning to happen a bit, I'm not sure, but it should happen. And then there have to be some debt forgiveness in Greece. Greece can never pay back its debts. Possibly in other countries, certainly in Greece, official debts must be written off. And if you put together those elements, the eurozone can struggle on without a catastrophe. But the reason I'm not 100% sure it'll survive is this problem with democracy. This annoying thing called democracy. At some point, there may be another Greek general election putting Syriza in power, or there may be an Italian election putting Grillo in power, or a referendum in Ireland on a new treaty, or a constitutional court ruling in Germany or Portugal. You just can't predict that there won't be some nasty problem that trips you up along the way. But probably there won't be, and I think probably the eurozone will muddle through without a catastrophe, even though it's not going to be growing nicely for quite a long time, I fear.
Eric?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Charles said about the eurozone. I mean, I have an article in the latest issue of Survival that looks at the Cyprus case and tries to illustrate how this kind of political accident could unfold and what are the conditions under which the euro could come unpicked. I also have an article in Survival from earlier in the year that's called the Goldilocks solution that looks at how much political union we actually need in order to stabilize the single currency. And I think I would focus on that. I mean, you don't actually need transcontinental or transmonetary union taxes and transfers, but you do need this elements of the banking union that Charles talked about. You have to have a single supervisory mechanism. You have to have a common resolution facility. You have to have a common resolution backstop, the funding necessary to ensure that you can actually wind up failed financial institutions. And most critically, you need to have common deposit insurance. I could tell you stories from the great state of Texas about how we discovered the importance of all of these things in the 1980s when we suffered under the Mexican default in the savings and loan crisis, and I would argue that they're absolutely vital in Europe today. And we hopefully will get some of those elements, but it will be a long time coming. And the question is, how much political union do you need in order to accept the implicit transfers in a common deposit insurance regime and a common resolution mechanism? But you don't need more political union than that. Having said that, there is a problem, right? When you build all of these institutions, you create standards. And the United Kingdom learned from the bitter experience of Ireland in 2008 that when somebody else changes their deposit insurance regime, you have to change yours. They learned in 2007 that when somebody else has different collateral rules from your collateral rules, your financial institutions are at a competitive disadvantage, which is why the Northern Rock went belly up. And in that context, these common standards would actually be very useful to have apply to financial institutions in the United Kingdom. And it would also be more useful to have financial institutions in the United Kingdom actually help to devise these common standards so that we had more robust standards across the European financial space as a whole. So I return to that original position. Of course,
Which is not going to be a very appealing one to
No.
Eurosceptics in Britain,
No.
I assume.
No, because they don't want to have, they want to have their own standards. It's, and this kind of, this jealous production of standards is quite at odds with the globalized nature of finance. In competitive terms, particularly when there is stress on the financial system, we see that, right? I mean, the utter failure of British deposit insurance, right, which paid out at 80% as opposed to complete coverage, the utter failure of British deposit insurance had to be reversed within a very short period of time because the own standard proved to be less than competitive. Now, having said that, there are lots of things that the Europeans do that are pretty boneheaded, and the fiscal compact is high on the list. Oddly, in the context of Alex's question, the European Commission is the only authority, international organization, that supports George Osborne in his pursuit of austerity. Everybody else, the OECD and the IMF, have been asking the British government to relax austerity. Only the European Commission, with its deep-seated belief in the fiscal compact and in the Brussels-Frankfurt consensus, offered its support and suggested that Osborne should even go further in consolidating British fiscal accounts. Now, having said that, there's one thing I would qualify in what Charles said. The British are not under the fiscal compact, but don't forget, the British did embrace the Stability and Growth Pact, not the excessive deficit procedure, but the commitment to stabilize your fiscal account, to have an account that is close to balance or in surplus over the medium term, which we now know is about 10 years. And the British have been engaged in at least in the fringes of macroeconomic policy coordination, and that's been to the good, not to the bad. Macroeconomic policy coordination, we know from the experience of the 1970s, is the key to achieving your own domestic macroeconomic objectives. If you ignore what the rest of the world is doing, particularly if you're a relatively small open economy, and the United Kingdom is a relatively small open economy in economic terms, if you ignore what the rest of the world is doing, then it's almost impossible to set your own instruments and achieve your objectives, right? You have to take the interaction effects into account, and the ECOFIN Council has been quite good at doing that.
Okay, well, we started 5 minutes late, and we're finishing 5 minutes late, which I hope is okay with everybody's schedule. I didn't organize, I didn't send out my invitations for this panel with the concept of a debate because I didn't expect a huge amount of disagreement, but what I think we have enjoyed is tremendous powers of illumination from a couple of different perspectives, and for that I am very grateful, and I hope you'll join me in expressing gratitude.